So we wanted to start before Rebecca goes into her story, just for you to think about, do you know someone who has disabilities or complex medical needs? So if you do, just think about them through this. And if you don't, we hope to share with you our story here today. What does pro-life mean to you? So there's a lot of people here joining, and pro-life might mean a variety of things to you, but we want just to expand that definition to you today with some of our stories. And I will go ahead and turn that over to Rebecca and Sam. Would you like? I'll go ahead and move.
Notes. I'm sorry. Thank you for inviting us to speak and being able to share our stories tonight. Sam was kind of a surprise to our family in more ways than one. He had two older brothers, and when I found out we were having Sam, we were very excited. And then early on, they sent us for special testing because of my age, and immediately red flags started going up. And then they did more testing, and they did an ultrasound at 14 weeks and came back and said, as they were doing the ultrasound, they got really quiet. And when they get really quiet, something's not okay at that point. And so the technician wouldn't really answer our questions and just kept going through. And, we're seeing him on the ultrasound and we're hearing his heartbeat and we see that life there, but she's not saying anything. And so she finishes and she brings the doctor in, and then they go through this list of everything they see wrong. Not what you want to hear at 14 weeks. They then said they felt like he had trisomy 18, which is incompatible with life, according to them, that they either die in utero before birth, within hours or days after birth. They said that he had, they looked at the shape of his head was different. There were cysts in the ventricles of his brain. They noticed issues with his heart. Both hands were like hanging down. His feet were clubbed. There was something about a measurement they take on the back of the neck that they saw. Just a lot of things. And so the doctor recommended at that point that we do an amniocentesis to confirm the diagnosis so that we could consider our options, is the way that it was worded. He never said the word abortion, but he did, allude to considering our options. And we just simply said, there's not an option for us. We believe we're pro-life. No matter what the diagnosis is, we will accept what God has given us, whether he is born alive, whether we get an hour or a day or a lifetime, that we would accept it that way. We did speak with our OB-GYN about doing the amniocentesis and found out more information on it to decide, is this something we want to do? And once I discussed with her the risks of it, one of the risks being it can cause spontaneous abortion. And the other issue that we had with it is, if they did the amniocentesis and they said that he had trisomy 18, at that point, they no longer treat the child. They no longer treat the baby. They no longer monitor the baby. They only monitor the mother. So if I went into labor and he went into distress, they do nothing for him, only for me, is what she told me. And I said, I'm not okay with that, because tests can be wrong. There's mistakes that happen. Things can change, and I also believed that God could heal. And so at that point, at 14 weeks, we said, no, we will not do this test. We will just wait and pray. And so the doctor said at 20 weeks, we would do another ultrasound. And if he had it, the growth retards and stops, and they would be able to tell, and they would be able to see the things on the ultrasound. That was the longest 6 weeks of our life, waiting and waiting, and not knowing what to tell the siblings, When we went for the second ultrasound, however, God had answered all those prayers, because literally every single thing they saw wrong was gone except the club feet. That was the only thing they saw, was club feet. And I mean, they kept going and going and going and looking on this ultrasound for the things. And so they simply said, he has club feet. He may have a syndrome, or he may simply have club feet, and we won't know until he's born. So, we went through the rest of the pregnancy that way. When he was born, we found out, he had the club feet. And then immediately we had to start into treatment at 10 days old. You can see in the picture with the red gown there, he was about 8 weeks at that point. So initially we had just club feet. By 3 weeks old, we found out he had hip dysplasia. By 4 weeks old, we found out he had 150-degree curvature of his cervical spine, which is life-threatening. And so at that point, he was diagnosed with something, a genetic syndrome called Larson syndrome. And Larson syndrome is a connective tissue disorder that affects all the connective tissue in your body, making all of your joints hypermobile, too loose. Everything moves when it shouldn't move, including his spine, including his feet, his hips, all those things. So that affected Sam in a lot of catastrophic ways. He couldn't swallow. He couldn't drink from a bottle and swallow it without aspirating on it. He couldn't do most of the things a normal baby could do. So in the picture you can see he had to have an NG tube at 8 weeks. And just, it was, our doctor referred to him as an onion because every time we were going to appointments at Texas Scottish Rite Hospital in Dallas, 4 to 5 days a week, driving from Arlington to Dallas, dropping my other children off at school, going to the hospital with him, treatment all day, get out in time to pick him up from school, go home, do life, and start over the next day. So our doctor referred to him as an onion because every time we were at an appointment, it was like peeling back another layer and discovering a new diagnosis, something else, something else, something else. But through it all, Sam was one of the happiest babies ever and was always silly. So in these pictures, you can see he had to get a wheelchair when he was 2 and learned how to drive it and could run you over and spin that thing around and speed. And we didn't teach him. He watched Sesame Street, and a child in a wheelchair on Sesame Street taught him how to use it, literally, because he got in and he took off. When he was 17 months old, Sam had to have a cervical fusion surgery where they had to go in and fuse his neck together and put him in a halo, which is the top picture there. He was in that halo for close to 6 months. We thought, okay, we're going to be good after this. Everything's going to get better. He came out of the halo, and within a month, his neck had collapsed worse than it was before. And that was the lowest of low for me as a parent, for our family, because our doctors looked at us and said, we don't know what to do. None of the doctors in our hospital know what to do. They asked other doctors around the state of Texas. They didn't know what to do. So our doctor started asking other doctors around the world, literally, what would you recommend? What do we do to save this child's life? What do we do to prevent this child from being paralyzed? So we ended up having to travel across the country to doctors up in the Northeast in Philadelphia. And at 2.5 years old, we had to do another surgery where Sam's neck was fused in the front and the back. So you can see here that x-ray on this side is his neck when he was born. And I don't know if you know what a normal neck looks like, but it's supposed to curve gently the opposite direction instead of the hairpin curve that it was. So it was literally compressing his spinal cord. So when I changed his clothes or fed him or bathed him, if I moved him wrong, I could have paralyzed him or killed him. He could have stopped breathing. Fortunately, that's where my background of working in physical therapy departments helped because I understood how to protect his spine. I understood what I needed to do. Scottish Rite had made some incredible custom-made braces for him to be in to protect him, and that kept him safe while he grew and got bigger and old enough and his bones strong enough for us to do the surgery. The one on the right side there, he was 2.5 years old, and then that's when we were in Philadelphia. And he went through 14 hours of surgery to fuse the front and the back. When we traveled up there, we had no idea we were having surgery. We just went for a consult. And the doctor said that he was so bad that he did not want us traveling back to Texas and having to come back, that he would not be able to sleep if he knew that. And so he literally had already booked a surgery time for us when he knew we were coming, and we didn't know that. So it was 14 hours of surgery. We knew during that time that there were 3 outcomes. He would either live and learn to walk and talk because his neck would be fixed. He would be paralyzed from the surgery itself, or he could die. So those were the outcomes that we went in knowing. I'm going to go back on the slide on this one. The picture in the middle, that was in pre-op that day, and he was being silly and laughing, and that was such a gift from God for us because inside, I'm smiling there, I was terrified. And yet you have to put on a brave face for your child so that they don't see you scared because they're feeding off of you and your cues. But he was being silly and laughing, so we were being silly and laughing as I'm literally handing him to a doctor and giving him his life to try and save. Anyway, the surgery was a success, thank goodness, as you can see by Sam sitting here now. He does everything that they said he would probably never do, and then some. Our doctors in Dallas finally, by the time he was about 4 or so, said they were going to stop saying what he would no longer do and start saying what he could do, because he kept proving him wrong. What disability means to me is learning to be flexible in life, learning to have goals for your child, but having them with a loose hand, knowing that they may be different and they'll be different than your other child. It also means having a sense of humor to survive the special needs life. And so this is our family. Having a child with a disability does not just affect that child, it affects the entire family. And there is no support and services out there for the most part for the family, for the parents as caregivers, for the siblings who are dealing with suddenly mom is gone. I mean, they basically lost mom for several years because 100% of my time practically was in his care. And you know, they would miss birthday parties with friends. I would miss school events with them, and we tried the best we could, but there's only so much you can do, and there's not a lot of support out there for families. And there needs to be more for siblings to be able to deal with this and talk about it and process it. They didn't have anybody to talk to, and we didn't know until much later, you know, what they felt like and how it affected them. But we did use humor. The boys were dressing him up and being silly. And then Sam was granted a Make-A-Wish trip in December of 2017 or 18. Oh yeah, my camera's wrong. And so we went as a family, and that was the best trip ever. We had not, as having a special needs child, you don't get to take vacations. You don't have the time, the money, or the capacity to travel much. And so this was really the first big trip we had ever taken as a family. And when we went, you stay at Give Kids the World, and they treat all the kids the same. The siblings are treated exactly like the child with the medically complex issues. And so they were all treated special, and it was so neat. And you felt normal because everyone around you lived the same life and experienced the same things, and nobody looked at you strange. You know, your child's in a wheelchair with a feeding tube or whatever. Nobody looks at it or bats an eye because everybody else has dealt with the same thing. Living with a child with a disability, you learn to build relationships. If you want to see if we want to see changes in our state, we have to get involved. Not just people with the medically complex child, but their entire family, their extended family, their church family, neighbors. Get involved and help by building relationships with those families and by building relationships with legislators and people who can affect change. Sam did Page for a Day program in the House of Representatives, and that is where he's standing there at the dais with his gavel. And so he was Page for a Day with our state representative, and that's building that relationship, that's opening that door and that communication. It's educating those legislators about these issues. This population of medically complex kids, you don't have the capacity to get involved. Medically complex kids don't vote, and legislators know that. Basically, they're voiceless. They're marginalized or unheard from. So what we learned as we were building relationships with legislators, there's two of our legislators there, that Senator Perry and Representative Parker, with our kids. As we've built the relationships over the years, what we have learned is it's a lack of knowledge. It is not that legislators don't care. It's that they don't know or they don't understand the issues. Unless you have a child with a disability or somebody in your family or somebody close, you don't understand the issues. So how can you help if you don't know? And that's where our families have been able to take our kids to the meetings, not just us go to the meetings, but take our kids to these meetings and let them see the issues and let them get to know the kids and see how special they are and see their personalities, whether they can talk or not. Some of the nonverbal kids speak more with their expressions and their smiles and their faces than other kids do with their words. And so it was very moving to see some of the legislators' reactions over the years to our children. This here is the one with Governor Abbott, was the day of our signing ceremony for the bill that we were able that we helped get passed in the last legislative session. And so Sam was very excited to meet the governor. That had been one of his goals. He had met a lot of representatives and senators, he was well known in the Capitol where people would call his name going down the hallways, but he had never met the governor. And so he was so excited that day to get to meet him and talk with him. The next picture is we held a celebration party we had at the end of session, and we invited legislators to attend. And this is many of our children. You can see all the different ages that we represent in our group. And that is, I think that's it for my story. I'll let Adrienne take over.
So nice that Rebecca went first on the scary part, so thank you. We're going to come together at the end with a back and forth, but I'll go ahead and tell my story with Hayden. And what I learned about disabilities is a whole list of drinking from a fire hose. So this is actually outdated when I looked at the last bit, because it said 25 surgeries, and my sweet boy has had 28 surgeries, and he's 12 years old. And these are, I've counted over 26 diagnoses. So you can see they're hard to read, much less pronounce. So the first thing that he has, his diagnosis, his umbrella diagnosis, is myelomeningocele spina bifida. And then with that is another umbrella of cerebral palsy, Chiari-2 brain malformation, agenesis of the corpus callosum, epilepsy, hypotonia, ataxia, apraxia, dysphagia, VP shunt, globally delayed gastric emptying, MACE, Mitrofanoff, bladder augmentation, hydrostenosis of the kidneys, G-tube, neurogenic bowel and bladder, bilateral strabismus, contractures due to high and low tone, hip dysplasia, autonomic dysreflexia, scoliosis, chronic and acute epididymitis, quadriplegic, and calcanea calvis bilateral foot surgery. Just for me to learn to pronounce those, it's overwhelming. And so that's why I like to have a list, not that we even focus on these, because I look at Hayden as a person and not all his diagnoses, but we have all of these diagnoses to have some sort of treatment or plans that we can go forward with in making good quality of life. Just to know that we have those. There's so many families that don't get a diagnosis. We seem to get every single diagnosis of the alphabet. But it gives us a plan and something that we can go work towards. So a little bit about my story. This last week I got to testify in session for Protect Texas Fragile Kids on behalf of Texas Right to Life legislation that Senator Perry was carrying. And I got to tell my story. And what I'm most surprised about when I walked in here with your director is seeing this picture in your offices here. And I was shocked that anyone even knew about it. The first picture up on the top left is baby Samuel. And I was emotional last week when I told my story in front of the Senate, because we were actually part of the study, the national study, and there were less than 200 people that participated in this over a 7-year course. And baby Samuel was the first to be twice born. What happened there was in utero surgery, and he came out and grabbed the surgeon's hand, and that was photographed. We were part of that study, and to back up to how we got to be a part of that was part of my testimony. Hayden was diagnosed in utero. He was diagnosed with very devastating, catastrophic diagnosis that said that he would be paralyzed and that he would have little to no brain function. I was given that information at my 20-week ultrasound when I had also just learned that his twin had passed away in utero. So the next thing that they offered me was to abort him, and I had just learned that my other twin had died. So that information was catastrophic and changed my life. And the more I tell it, maybe I can get through the story a little bit better. But with that, I was very lucky, because my doctor that was telling me about all this actually helped to educate me, and most people don't get that education. And she gave me just a glimmer of hope, and she said, there is a national study that's being done. If you can fly out and leave your job and leave your family and go have this immediate surgery, there is a chance that he could have a better quality of life if you're willing to leave and move within a matter of weeks. So because he was a very purposeful pregnancy, we absolutely dropped everything. We arranged for childcare for my other child and went out to be part of this national study. And something that's important for pro-life to know, and there's being argued in legislation if there is pain when you're doing a late-term abortion, because that is still standard procedure when you get some of these catastrophic diagnoses. And little baby Samuel, and in this study, the reason we were part of the study and it took so long to get people to participate is because the babies and the mothers were dying during the surgery because they couldn't control the pain. And the pain was so horrific to recover from. But now it has passed and they've controlled it, and it's now nationally done in the major children's hospitals. So to have been a part of this, it's really nice to see the full cycle. One of his 28 surgeries, his 26th surgery was done here in Houston with the neurosurgeon at Memorial Hermann. And his billboard is on the highway here that we saw on our way coming from Austin. And they're now doing this in utero surgery here in Houston. And so we're very grateful that that's an option. What I want to show you is what it looks like to be born with spina bifida. It's a Latin term meaning that your spine is outside your body. So that big bubble is your nerve endings. His spine never closed, his column never closed. And so afterwards, you'll see the stitches on his little bottom there is where they actually tucked in his spinal cord and sewed him shut. And because of that, he grew scar tissue year after year after year and had to have repeated spine surgery to get rid of the scar tissue. And the bottom picture on the left is when he was born. He was transported to the brand new Dell Children's Hospital, and he was the first successful complex care transfer. So Hayden, your booty looks really cute right there. So he's embarrassed. But this is really, it's unusual to get to see the spina bifida because they're taken by ambulance, and I never got to see or touch him for 5 days after he was born. And so what else disability has meant to me has been a complete change of my career. It's been a complete change of the visibility and telling our story, and the most personal things that happened to us has given us an opportunity to help educate others. And on the bottom are my other 2 children. So I have one older than Hayden and one younger, and they've been great troopers and walked around the Capitol and helped educate. We had a rally, and that's why I'm holding the microphone. I'm not just yelling at my kids through a microphone, but I would like to. And then you'll see Hayden and my daughter Hannah have also been Senate and House pages. And so it gets them the exposure for the legislators to get to see what living with disabilities looks like. And we have been able to be interviewed on local and national media. So I just want to go forward with that. But, he was loving it. And this was, again, with our signing ceremony with the governor. The governor actually uses our same wheelchair vendor. So it was really good to see when you can see people that look like you, that are contributing members of the society. It's really a good thing for these kids too. So you can see that they can contribute, they can be active contributing members of society. So what we want to talk about is a little bit, and this is what we do with education, is about stigma and discrimination. And we still have a very long battle for stigma and discrimination, and we appreciate this opportunity to speak to you today to really help squash what that is. And again, we use Medicaid. I also, there's a large population of us that have kids that use Medicaid based on their disability and not on family income, because no family income can support a disabled child. Hayden, when he was born, maxed out it was before the ACA, and he had maxed out his lifetime limit on his insurance before he left the hospital. So he'd already maxed out on over $2 million before we even left the hospital. So it's no amount of money really any family can support the medical complications and procedures and all that it takes to raise these children. So we're very grateful for Medicaid, but we also have our primary insurance that pays the bulk, and Medicaid can pick up the secondary so that we can be at home. So what the stigma was then is what we wanted you just to think back and reflect a little bit about then. What was the stigma back then? And you think about the Nazis and the T4 program. So when they first came with the Nazis, they rounded up the people of Jewish descent. And then they came for the disabled, and they claimed that they were unfit. And there were so many horrible things and atrocities that were done to the disabled population and tests as well. Another thing that you can think about that was then, when the press broke about Willowbrook, and you learned about some of the atrocities that were taking place in the institutions and how disabled people were horribly treated. And that was a really big expose that really brought to light that we don't just take these families and put them away and hide them, because they still live and they were treated horrifically, not being in the care of someone that actually loves and takes care of them. And what I have this picture of is President Ronald Reagan, the Katie Beckett story. So I want to read a little bit about that to you. And you heard about our legislator earlier that's been a big advocate for us, and his name is Tan Parker, and he has his own book that he has published. And one of the things that he's talking about in this book is addressing social fabric of our society. And it's President Ronald Reagan emerged as an early pioneer. This Katie Beckett waiver was actually in 1981. She was paralyzed and dependent on a ventilator. Her parents had her in a hospital for 3 years until Vice President George Bush shared their story with President Ronald Reagan, who recognized this injustice. The family could not bring her home. They couldn't care for her because they could not provide for her. It was costing in 81 $6,000 a month. Our 1 day stay in the ICU is $11,000. So that's just 1 day in the ICU. But this was $6,000 a month in 81. And they had done the analysis, the financial analysis, and he said, families cannot even afford 1/6 of the amount to keep them home. So, and it was enacting this legislation, the Katie Beckett waivers, which gave funding for families like ours to have our children at home and not in institutions, and saved the state quite a bit of money to have them be cared for by their families with better health outcomes. So it was really a wonderful legislation that's gone state to state on some of these waiver programs. The next thing that I want to talk about with then is this picture on the right is the right to education. Most of these children, when I grew up, they weren't in your school, they weren't in your classroom, and it wasn't even very long ago. So Arlington ISD, this is their first ventilator dependent, and it was a polio child that got to go to school. So, and that was in the 60s, and it was only in the recently until the 60s that children with disabilities were even allowed to be in public schools. So the then wasn't that long ago. We're talking about education, and then just families like ours just getting to have our kids home. And so we'll also talk about what is the stigma and discrimination now. Here we are now. We've got our kids at home. So our families can be together. They belong together. They do better together. There, as has been mentioned in my bio, I'm on the board of Dell Children's Hospital, and I've been working with the UT Medical School. And there's now these studies done on the full cycle of care. Doctors had only studied at the time, what happens when they're in the hospital, but there's not been any studies done once they're discharged from the hospitals and they're cared for at home. And what happens during that time if they keep them out of the hospital, and that's still an ongoing study, but they are showing that families are doing better at home. And if we're given the appropriate supports, and those appropriate supports are critical to our families. And when they're taken away, that's what's led us to the legislators, because when we don't have our supports at home, we can't do our jobs. We have to take them to the hospitals. And when we can't do our jobs, it costs so much more to take them to the hospitals. Just as I was saying, $11,000 a day in the ICU. One of the things that's happening right now is the preborn discrimination, providing education and resources. So what happens when a child is diagnosed in utero? Some of the first things that they're tested for at the early weeks, and you know since you've had a recent child, is Down syndrome, trisomy, spina bifida are some of the 3 major ones, congenital heart defects and others. Those are diagnosed earlier so that they can be aborted earlier. And that is why they're looking for those markers so early. But also some of these, as Rebecca had mentioned, and I mentioned, that diagnosis didn't happen until much later. And so then they're looking at late-term abortions and not a lot of options. And the doctors really aren't educating. And I was very fortunate when I talked to other families that have spina bifida, and Hayden's one of the most severe forms of spina bifida, and had such a terrible prognosis in utero that most doctors don't even take the time to educate, because they'll say, I don't know that the family can sustain this or the quality of life of this child. They make that determination without trying to educate the parent. And there's also that's just the in utero. But there's also so much discrimination after birth. Children with certain diagnoses are denied access to treatment or equal care with organ transplants or other interventions, or denied or not covered for individuals with disabilities. In Austin, there was in the press a really horrible story of a man that was not getting treatment for COVID because he was disabled. And it was recorded, and he died. He passed away, and he was young, and he was in his 40s, and they wouldn't treat him for COVID because they didn't feel that he had the quality of life to receive that treatment. So it's very easy to marginalize our invisible populations.
So it's hard to, when these patients are in a facility or in the home with these diagnoses, our families don't always go out and about, because it is literally to take a trip like this. It looks like you're moving out of your house. You load up so much stuff because there's so much equipment that has to be brought with you to care for your child, whether you're going on an overnight trip or a 2-week trip. So these children and adults aren't seen. So it's easy to marginalize them if you don't know about them. And that's where the education component is so important. It's getting them involved in society, or in educating society about them if they can't be out in society, letting them know. It all comes back to the whole thing of who determines that life is worthy of living. Who makes that determination? Is it the doctors? Is it the medical team? Is it the government? Or is it that individual and that family? And ultimately, it should always be that individual, if they're able to make that choice themselves, or their family, who gets to make the choice of whether to continue treatment or to go on hospice or discontinue life-sustaining treatments. However, in Texas, we have a law that you've probably all heard a lot about recently in the press, the 10-day law, or the 10-day rule, where any facility, hospital, nursing home, care facility of any kind, for whatever reason, a medical provider can deem that the person is, that it's not worth continuing treatment, and they can then say they're stopping treatment, and they give you 10 days to get your family member or loved one moved from their facility to another facility. Now, 10 days is not very long, and you add in there 2 weekends where you can't do anything, and you've got maybe about 5 good days of working. Call any specialist and ask when you can get your first available appointment. Try to get an appointment with a neurologist, top neurologist in the country, or even just somebody, at your local children's hospital. You're not going to get in 5 days. You're not going to be able to get a transfer to another facility in that amount of time. It's a death sentence. The provider determines that they're going to do this. They have an ethics committee meeting where they call the family member in. Generally, they have no legal representation. They don't know what they're walking into. They don't know they're going to be bombarded with this for the most part. And then they're told this. And the hospital says, we don't deem their case as your loved one's case is viable. So baby Tinsley is in Cook Children's Hospital in Fort Worth, and we have been working extensively with her case, and Texas Right to Life has been working and handling her case for since November of 2019, when we got the phone call asking if we could get involved and help. And we have been involved since then, and fighting for her life, and going to court and testifying, and trying to get her appropriate medical treatment when the hospital refuses to treat her, deeming her life unworthy, saying that she was going to die imminently back in November of 2019, that they should withdraw treatment. It was hopeless. And a year and a half later, she's still living. And we could have helped the family move her out of the hospital with appropriate interventions and support through palliative care or hospice care. Various things, various options were out there, and the hospital has blocked us because they don't deem her life worthy. So as a state, we have to decide who gets to make that choice. And right now, we're on the wrong side of that. People with disabilities should be active members in the community. They need to see role models. They need to see people out there not just living, but being successful and enjoying life, having fun, There are different disability expos now where there's a dance squad that are in wheelchairs and they do a whole routine, or there's basketball teams. University of Texas at Arlington has one of the best men's wheelchair basketball teams in the nation, and they win they win championships all the time. And it's neat to go watch those things and to go see what they're able to do. The catastrophic effect of disabilities. We've both experienced a lot of this. Loss of income. We went from a 2-income family to a 1-income family after Sam was born. Then you add on top of that the massive medical bills, even with incredible insurance. It was about $5,000 a month over and above what our insurance was. We were at a point of, do we sell our house? Do we declare bankruptcy? What do we do to be able to provide the feeding supplies and medical equipment our child needs while still feeding our other children and clothing them and providing a house for them, a roof over their head? How do you deal with that? And that's where the Medicaid waiver for us helped us and provided that safety net for us. Job loss, Adrienne can talk to that, I believe.
Yeah, so this is the fun part of our slide that's really optimistic.
Yeah.
But what we want to say here too is that our kids get this waiver because they would be institutionalized otherwise, because they're so severe. In order to qualify for this, we had to go stay in a nursing home when he was an infant. And then the nursing home had to say, we're not qualified to take care of an infant at this level. So then they get us out of the institution in the nursing home so that we can be at home. So it's really intense. And to add that intensity as a parent and try to work is impossible. And so I had a career in finance prior to this, and there was no way to live in the hospital for 3 months of every year for the past 7 years. There was no way for me to work a 60-hour work week when I'm in a hospital, and as Rebecca said, going back and forth to doctor's appointments daily when they're first born for years, and to go through those. So this is the catastrophic effect that happens to these families immediately. And to not have those supports set up is immediately devastating. So all of those things, coupled with divorce rates in the special needs family, we even argue if it's as generous as 85%. So divorce rates are hard because this is such an intense, catastrophic event that happens that goes on for years. And so really being able to live under that intense pressure really takes a toll on families without, with supports or without. So there's a chronic mental and physical toll on the caregiver and family. There's also isolation. We have found each other in different cities, but we make an effort for that. Most families are so exhausted, like Rebecca had mentioned, you can't even leave to go to do the simplest of things. So we make a real effort for that, but it's brought us together.
Well, and you lose friendships too, some dear friends, and not anything ill against them, but when they invite you to go do something with them over and over and over, and you can never go because you don't have care for your medically complex child, you can't leave them with a babysitter, you can't leave them with just anybody, you have to have a nurse or somebody to care for them. You don't get to go out and have coffee, or you don't get to go out and have a girls' night out or have a date night. I mean, you have to be intentional in planning all those things, and sometimes it's just not possible. And so you lose friendships. But we've also built friendships with other families in the similar situations that we are. Meeting with our constant hospitalizations and doctor's appointments, we meet in doctor's offices and in hospitals and form friendships with people across the country, because many of our families travel like to Boston or to Philadelphia or come down to Houston for medical care, and you meet people from everywhere, and you meet people with your child's same syndrome if you're lucky. And it's so helpful, I guess. It's like you can take a breath of fresh air when you meet somebody who understands. You don't have to explain it, you don't have to talk about it, they just understand and they get it. And that's so refreshing to have that, because it's so hard to find. And it's not, I mean, I have wonderful friends that we've been blessed with and people that are close to us, but unless you've lived the life, you don't understand all of it, and sometimes you just need somebody to talk to that understands it.
And so what I'll start with as well is our executive director for PTFK, Hannah Mehta, is here, and thank you for all the work that you did to organize our grassroots effort. The access to appropriate care and services started because we weren't finding it. What happened with all of us when it became, when there was a change in Medicaid and how it was delivered to our families, and suddenly we couldn't get food, we couldn't get our wheelchairs, we couldn't get the basic things, catheters that my son uses 5 times a day. I couldn't even get those for a period of 3 months. And you can't buy these things in any store. So even if we wanted to purchase them, you can't buy them. So we started losing services, and that's how we formed. We came together. So we really need those supports and services that are daily important to us. So that's how we started. And this quote is from Governor Abbott, and it says, "Texas stands at the forefront of upholding the sanctity and dignity of human life and protecting the most vulnerable among us." So that is Governor Abbott's quote. We'll show you what we've been working on. How can Texas truly lead the way in protecting life? We have had 2 rallies at the Capitol, and we have gathered together quite a significant amount of legislators that have been working with us and supporting us on a bipartisan level. Rebecca will go ahead and speak at some of these slides as well.
Yeah, so quickly, on the upper left-hand side there, one day we were at our Capitol display. We've done a Capitol display at the beginning of session, the last 2 sessions, where we set up a display and educate and talk to legislators. And we were just talking to one of the legislators, Representative Johnson from, I believe she's from Houston
Yes.
here. And she has family members with special needs children. And she just, she looked at her kids and she's like, "Hey, would you like to go see the house?" And she took us up there and she gave them a tour of the house floor, and we got that picture there and had wonderful conversation with her. And that's building those relationships. You never know, just one conversation, what can happen and what can spiral out of that. We've met many different legislators, as you can see.
Well, let's go back on that. I do want to say in the center, Senator Perry has been a great advocate for us. He is the one that carried Senate Bill 1207 that protected our rights to choose who our providers are. And that's so critical for us because we are so specialized. We develop these relationships that are trusted for our families, that we can call on during an ice storm, or that we can call on their cell phone. So he's developed that legislation for us. I do want to read this quote from Tan Parker as well in the House that's been a huge advocate for us. It says, "As policymakers, we must be willing to recognize that this is what pro-life looks like in action. We have a moral obligation to fight for every life from conception to natural death." So we're having huge support, but we still want to educate at the Capitol.
So these slides here are some of our display that we put up. Many of them are newspaper quotes from newspaper articles from the Pain and Profit series that the Dallas Morning News did regarding these issues with the Texas Medicaid system and children and adults with disabilities, and how our state cares for or treats those people and those individuals. And so we have many quotes there from those. Living in Texas with disabilities, we currently rank 49th in the nation for supports and services. Texas likes to be number 1 in everything, and we seem to be at the bottom of the list with this one, and we seem to be fine with it, and that's not okay.
So my son is on a waiver list because of his disabilities, and we are on a 15-year wait list for home and community-based medical waiver programs for other families that are not qualified to go to a nursing home. So there's a huge wait list of families that are trying to access Medicaid because of their disabilities, and it keeps getting narrower and the restrictions are tougher each year.
Then we talk about the 10-day rule, which I'd already mentioned, where they can withdraw care at any time determined by an administrative committee. And you think that's just for people with disability. That can be anybody. That can be any one of you. You're one car accident or one illness or one catastrophic diagnosis away from that. You can get sick and have an allergic reaction, an anaphylactic shock, and suddenly be in a coma, and somebody say, "Hey, they're not going to recover." It can be anything. So this is something that we all need to think about, is how that could affect your family member or yourself. We also talk about the organ transplants and treatments can be denied, and there's no law preventing that. So somebody who needs an organ transplant that has a disability, they can simply say, "You don't qualify," and you don't get on the list. And there's nothing protecting them in the state of Texas from that. It's a constant battle to remain in the community for our families, to keep our kids at home and not have to put them in an institution or be in the hospital. It's something that we all strive for. We want them at home. We do everything within our power to avoid ER visits. That's the last place we want to go. And we avoid hospitalizations. We do everything we can to save ourselves that and prevent our child from having that, which ultimately saves money for our insurance and for the Medicaid waivers. The last thing here is that there's 13 crumbling, abuse-ridden state institutions. They're state-supported living centers is what they're called in Texas. They're ripe with issues. There's been investigations on them. But the biggest issue right now is these 13 buildings are crumbling, and the annual state budget, just to maintain the building, this isn't to pay staff or take care of the patients in it or the residents in it. This is just to maintain the buildings. That annual budget to maintain those buildings is the same as the annual budget for the entire home and community-based service programs in Texas. So if we consolidated some of these state-supported living centers and moved some of that funding to community-based services, we could have a lot more individuals at home instead of having to go to an institution, giving their families support and services where they can keep them at home. So that is critical, and that is a change that as a state we need to make a priority, we believe. What can you do? Get involved. Biggest thing, support current legislation. If you go to Protect Texas Fragile Kids Facebook page, our website, we put up legislation that's coming up, especially on our Facebook page, that we need people to support and to call their legislators, or legislation that we need them to oppose. And we put that up and we ask for people to call and talk to their legislators and tell them, or call the committee members, or go testify on the issues.
I'll go ahead and mention that we have 3 that we would like you to support to look at. Representative Parker has filed 3677, 3678, and 3679.
Advocate for future changes. Get involved, advocate. If you don't know how, reach out to somebody already involved. Reach out to somebody in our group. Reach out to somebody in another group that for people with disabilities or special needs, and ask them, how can I help? What can I do? Contact your state legislators. It's really simple. I mean, I was so nervous the first time I called, and probably the first dozen times I called a state legislator's office, but they don't eat you alive. It's just a phone call, and it literally takes maybe 2 minutes, usually less than that, to call and voice your opinion. You give your name, you say, I'm a constituent, I would like the legislator to support or to oppose such and such bill, and they might ask you why, they might ask your address. It's so simple to do. But it really does make a difference. The other thing is educate others. We reach out. That's our biggest thing with Protect Texas Fragile Kids, besides the legislative advocacy, is educating others, educating families. For my family, like out in public, educating others when they ask questions. Don't be afraid to ask questions when you see somebody with a disability. Just don't say, what's wrong with your child? Because there's nothing wrong with them. God made them this way, and they're perfect to us. Worded in a different way where it's not what's wrong, but ask questions, get to know them, find out about them, talk with them, and then educating the families of people with disabilities and how to navigate the system of what do they need to do. Like Adrienne read those diagnoses. When you get thrown into this life, you literally have to learn a foreign language. You have to learn medical terminology, and we have to become experts in our child's diagnoses. Because many times, for some of our kids, their diagnoses are so rare, our doctors have never treated a child with it, and you have to become the expert, and you literally have to educate your doctor and the medical team many times about your child and their issues. The next thing is donate to organizations that support the families or that support advocacy, and volunteer. We're always looking for volunteers, and I know a lot of organizations are. So, and this is our last one, is Sam. My life is important. I need you to stand up and protect me. To fight for Protect Texas Fragile Kids. So this is Sam. He begged me not to speak. He gets nervous in front of people. So this is Sam. And Sam is 12. And Sam shouldn't be able to do anything he's able to do now, but we know that with all the hard work and determination and appropriate supports, he's able to. Without the Medicaid waiver program, even with our insurance, we wouldn't have gotten the therapies he needed. He's had literally hundreds or probably closer to thousands of PT, OT, and speech, 2.5 years of feeding therapy to learn how to eat, PT to learn how to crawl, stand, walk, occupational therapy for so many other things. These are things that are essential because now, as he gets bigger, he doesn't need as many services. Had he not received them at the appropriate time early on, it becomes a lifelong thing. And so that's early intervention is key with many of our kiddos, appropriate intervention and providing the services. So Their lives are important. I always say, what does pro-life mean to you? In our state, we like to claim that we're pro-life, but in many aspects, our state is pro-birth. We tell the parents that get these catastrophic diagnoses in utero, please don't abort the baby, please have the child. They don't abort, they have the child, and then we say, thank you, good luck. And you're on your own. That's not truly pro-life. We have to be there for these families once these children are born. So that's our goal, is to educate and to make changes where our state sees the value in these kids' lives, not just them being born, but in them living.
Thank you. I think that we turn it over for questions.
Thank you so much to both of you for speaking, and thank you, Sam. So are you going to run for president one day? He says maybe.
Speaker of the House.
He wants to be Speaker of the House.
That's
was
awesome.
his,
You were pretty
was his
good with
initial
that
goal.
gavel. All right. Well, we do have several
back down,
questions for you. So what are some ways that we can volunteer, and what cities?
I'll let you answer that one. You're better.
Well, this legislation session has been very difficult because the Capitol, and with COVID, getting into access, the legislators has been very difficult. But you can volunteer by helping us distribute information, to make calls. On our website, there is a volunteer spot where you can go on and register and log your name and that information, so we can have a database if you are able to volunteer. The cities, because we will help carry this message in every city in the state, because disabilities runs throughout the state. So we do a lot of work in Austin, but we're really in every single city in the state.
And we need things even as simple as, somebody who specializes in web design to keep up our website and help with that, because we are not tech people. We are special needs moms. We need people who can do that. We need people who can help with fundraising. That is key. We literally operate on pennies in our group. And we can make 2 pennies scream. And so we need people who specialize in fundraising, are willing to help us with that. People who are able to network with businesses and get businesses maybe to sponsor or come on board. What are some of the other things we're always asking for?
We're asking for everything. We're just
Yeah.
special needs families, and we really appreciate when dads show up.
Yes.
There's a lot of moms, so.
Yeah, we love it when dads get involved.
Great. All right. Another question is, what was the name of the test that you chose not to undergo? Because if the result was positive, they would no longer treat Sam as a patient. Was it the amniocentesis test?
Yes.
Or others as well?
It was the amniocentesis test.
Do you think that's still the case? Will doctors still no
It's
longer
been
treat the
12
child?
years, so
Okay.
I don't know. I do know that trisomy 18, which they said was incompatible with life, they're finding now that isn't necessarily the case, because there are many kids who have that now who are living, and the difference is it's being treated now. They're not just being allowed to die, they're being treated. But it is a battle, and there's a family that I know our director is helping right now that has a child with this diagnosis and is battling to get the baby or the child treated. So it's an education thing also. Rick Santorum, I don't know if you guys remember him when he ran for president. He had a daughter with trisomy 18. And, she obviously, I think at the time, was maybe 5 or 6 years old. She was living. And so I think the issue is, it's not necessarily fatal for all children. Some of them it is, but you have to treat it.
And I do just want to say, for my son's trial that we were part of, he had to have the amniocentesis to qualify for the trial. So the test itself, you just want to ask about.
Yeah, and it's something each family has to weigh. We knew we weren't changing our decision no matter what, so we decided it wasn't. Every medical procedure has risk with it. And so we just decided the risk outweighed the benefit of doing that test, because we weren't changing our mind. We weren't going to abort him. We were keeping him no matter what. So for us, it just wasn't worth it.
That's good to know. And quick comment on that. We have a list of pro-life OB-GYNs who will continue to treat the child as a patient if they get a bad diagnosis. So if you are looking for a good doctor, you can ask probably you guys, in addition to Texas Right to Life. So another question was about Sam's original diagnosis, which turned out to be incorrect. Can you remind us what that was?
The original diagnosis that they thought in utero was trisomy 18, based on the initial scans at 14 weeks and some blood tests and genetic testing and things they had done. But then further ultrasounds, they said he didn't have it. So, doctors are wonderful, and I love doctors, and I'm grateful for doctors, but they're not God and they're not perfect and they make mistakes and diagnoses can be wrong. And we
Right.
have to remember that.
And they're still practicing medicine
Yeah.
for a reason.
Well, it's so interesting to note that, sometimes miracles happen and the diagnosis ends up being wrong. But even if the diagnosis is correct, y'all have shown that there are new resources available and so much help for families now, in much part due to your hard work. So thank you for that. Let's see. Well, another question was, are you familiar with perinatal hospice care and what is that like?
So perinatal hospice care, I think, is for those that maybe do not expect life to continue, and the hospice care that they can refuse medical procedures or not seek medical treatments and have the dignity of taking the course of life to the end at home, so that they're not having to be hospitalized the entire time, so that that's an option for them to be at home.
Great, thank you. So, have you seen in any case if a hospital or a doctor gets involved in guardianship questions over the children who have these diagnoses?
I have not encountered that.
I have not encountered that either.
Okay, well, it might have been a plant question from our lawyer who wants people to know
Okay.
that sometimes unfortunately, if a hospital doesn't want to treat the child anymore, they will actually attempt to strip the family of guardianship rights of their own child, which is so tragic. And I'm glad that y'all did not experience that. Sounds
What
like
we-
you had good doctors.
Can I add in? What we do see, though, is when families seek second opinions or question a doctor and seek, other facilities, some doctors get their feelings hurt and report the family to CPS. And so we're seeing that a lot with kiddos who the family, doesn't agree with the doctor's diagnoses or the doctor's treatment plan and would like to get a second opinion. And then because of that, suddenly they have a CPS investigation on them, which I don't know if you've heard about the Pardo case, but that's probably one of the most, the one that's been in the news the most over the last, year and a half or so. And it was a case just like that where they disagreed and they sought another opinion and it snowballed. And then you have to fight to get your child back.
I just will add to that because we're tracking legislation as well. On Monday, there's a hearing about criminalizing parents. And often, like Rebecca's mentioned, not in my case, but these families would go through a battery of tests trying to figure out what is causing an illness or what might improve quality of life. And so some of these tests are not always appropriate, and you'll find out years later that maybe there was, these were not the best tests, or they maybe have harmed the child. And so there's legislation that's being heard on Monday that would criminalize parents like us. So it really put another burden on families, saying now we have to prove that we don't have Munchausen's, that we're not harming our child, that we're going through doctor recommended testing and trying to find help for our child, but there's actually legislation that would make it a criminal penalty and a felony on us. So we're not only just battling to keep our kids alive, but we're trying to keep ourselves now from being criminalized.
I know for me with Sam, he's 12 years old now. Things have changed since he was younger in this issue. This issue wasn't a big deal when he was born and when he was little. And when he was little, there were many things I pushed on, and I loved our doctors, but I would push back on them and I would challenge them. And there were times where I said, I know something isn't right. And they're like, we can't find it. And I'm like, I see this, this, and this, and something's not right. And I pushed and pushed. And all of a sudden, we finally got the right test, and like, oh my goodness. And so prime example was 2016. All of a sudden, Sam went from walking to his leg collapsing and him falling all the time and his leg going numb and pain, etc. Well, one of the discs in his back was slipping off the other disc. But when they did an x-ray with him standing still, it did not show. It did not show until we went to the doctor who had fixed his neck, and he did special x-rays with him moving, that it showed the disc almost completely slipping off, which would have paralyzed him from about the waist down. Had I not pushed one fall, because after they diagnosed him, the doctor said, don't let him fall. I said, are you kidding? He's falling multiple times every day. I can't not let him fall. But had I just accepted that diagnosis and went on, I don't know what would have happened. However, now with the way things are, I second guess myself when I question a doctor. I second guess, should I be pushing on this? Are they going to suspect this? Are they going to ask questions? I had a doctor, a new doctor that we hadn't seen before, ask some questions that were very strange questions to me that I felt like were kind of alluding to some of this, like, have you ever talked to anybody about these things? And, and I didn't even catch it at the time. It was after the appointment that I realized what the line of questioning was. And then I was mad, because we are our child's advocate and we have to know, we know them better than anybody else because we live with them all the time. So we have to be able to ask questions.
All right, well, final question now. You'd mentioned bipartisan support a little while ago. Can you tell us more about that and which legislators were the most helpful?
So when Senate Bill 1207 passed in the House, it was passed unanimously by both sides. You don't see that a lot, but this issue seems to pull, both sides in and be unifying in some ways. Not always, but in some ways it does. I'll let you add to.
And who's been most helpful? I think it's anyone that's willing to stand up and really fight for our cause. And we've had so many that are willing to stand up for us, but those that truly go to battle for us and truly educate the other representative and other senators, those have been the most helpful to us. You've seen a couple of their pictures here today, so I don't want to neglect, I feel like it's like an Academy Award. You don't want to, leave anyone off because we've had such great support. And so you've seen some of their pictures here today, and then at the very beginning of who helped us pass 1207, but it was bipartisan, and we're not really looking to be a political football used by either group. We're just living our lives trying to get the supports to keep our kids at home. And Medicaid, the budget in Texas has been terrible, and it has not grown. And now we have all these supports coming from the federal government to improve the budget. So we're really hopeful that these waiver lists will be expanded, or at least decreased, not expanded, but just decreased, because the wait lists have been so long. And now that we have this extra money, that is really tagged for these reasons, we hope that they're not used elsewhere, that they're used for these critical families.